"You can't evict us, we're your parents," my dad spat after receiving an eviction notice. I stood firm. 2 weeks later, I arrived at the house with the sheriff. I never imagined I'd be standing in my driveway at 8:30 a.m. on a Thursday morning, watching as Sheriff Martinez supervised my parents loading their belongings into a rented U-Haul truck. My mother's eyes were red and puffy from crying, while my father's face was a mask of barely contained rage. Neither would look at me directly. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains, undoubtedly adding this scene to the community gossip mill. I should have felt guilty, heartbroken, or at least conflicted about legally evicting my own parents. Instead, all I felt was an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with the bitter satisfaction of finally standing up for myself. 3 months earlier, I never would have believed I'd be capable of this. But that was before I heard them laughing about me being their personal bank, before I realized that to them I wasn't a daughter, I was just a walking ATM. My name is Rita, 32 years old, and this is how I finally broke free from a lifetime of financial and emotional exploitation at the hands of the people who were supposed to love me most. I grew up in a household where money was always discussed but never quite enough. My parents weren't poor, but they lived beyond their means and treated saving as an optional activity. Meanwhile, I was the studious, responsible child who worked weekends at the local grocery store from age 16 while maintaining a 4 GPA. I was the first in our family to graduate college, working 3 part-time jobs to supplement my scholarships. After graduation, I landed an entry-level position at a financial technology company in Seattle. The starting salary wasn't impressive, but I lived frugally, shared an apartment with 2 roommates, and set aside money each month. My parents, meanwhile, faced one financial emergency after another. Dad's car broke down, Mom needed dental work not covered by insurance. Their roof leaked during a particularly bad winter. Each time they called me, their reliable daughter who was doing so well, for help. At first, I didn't mind. These were my parents after all. The people who had raised me, who had made sacrifices for me growing up, or so I believed at the time. Each request came with promises of repayment that never materialized and heavy doses of guilt when I hesitated. "After everything we've done for you," my mother would say, her voice thick with disappointment, "we gave up so much to give you a good life." By my late 20s, I had worked my way up to a senior analyst position with a salary that finally allowed me some breathing room. I had been saving aggressively for a down payment on a property, knowing that the Seattle housing market would only get more expensive. When I found a modest 3-bedroom house in Renton for $340,000, I jumped at the opportunity. It wasn't my dream home, but it was in good condition in a decent neighborhood, and most importantly, it was an investment in my future. 2 weeks after closing, my parents called with news that turned my life upside down. They were being evicted from their apartment. Dad had lost his job 6 months earlier and hadn't found a new one. They had nowhere to go and no savings to speak of. "We're your parents, Rita," my father said, his voice breaking in a way I'd rarely heard. "We'd never ask if we had any other option." Against my better judgment, and despite the warnings from my 2 closest friends, I offered them my investment property as a temporary solution. I would continue renting my apartment in the city close to work, and they could stay in the house until they got back on their feet. We agreed on 6 months, with the understanding that they would use this time to find jobs and save for their own place. 6 months stretched into a year became 2. Each time I brought up the subject of them moving out, I was met with excuses, health concerns, or guilt trips about family loyalty. "Blood is thicker than water, Rita," became my mother's mantra. "Family takes care of family." Meanwhile, I was paying the $1,950 monthly mortgage, covering utilities averaging $380 a month, and addressing every maintenance issue that arose. When the water heater failed, $1,200. When the furnace needed repairs, $800. When the gutters needed replacing, $2,300. All of it fell on me. Worse, my parents seemed to have abandoned the idea of finding work altogether. My father, at 58, declared himself too old to start over despite being a skilled electrician in an area with construction booming. My mother, 56, claimed her fibromyalgia made working impossible, though she somehow managed to garden for hours and attend weekly book club meetings. The financial drain was enormous, but the emotional toll was even greater. I delayed my own goals, including a master's degree I wanted to pursue, because I couldn't afford both tuition and supporting my parents. My dating life suffered. explaining to potential partners that a significant portion of my income went to supporting my fully capable parents was not exactly attractive. The few times I brought serious boyfriends home, my parents behaved so entitled and embarrassed me so thoroughly that the relationships inevitably faltered. By year 3 of this arrangement, my resentment was building, but the chains of obligation and filial duty kept me trapped. That is, until a random Tuesday afternoon in April changed everything. I had taken a rare personal day from work to meet a plumber at the house. The garbage disposal had stopped working, and my parents were insisting it needed immediate attention. I had texted them that morning to confirm I'd be coming around 1 p.m. with the plumber. My mother had responded with a thumbs-up emoji. When I pulled into the driveway at 12:45, I noticed several unfamiliar cars parked outside. Strange, since my parents had claimed they would be out running errands until around 2 p.m. I used my key to enter and heard voices and laughter coming from the kitchen. I quietly approached, not wanting to interrupt what seemed to be some kind of gathering. That's when I heard my name. "Rita is so easy to manipulate," my mother was saying, her voice carrying clearly down the hallway. "All I have to do is mention how hard we worked to raise her and she folds immediately." Laughter followed. I froze, my hand on the wall, unable to move forward or retreat. "She's our personal ATM," my father chimed in. "The garbage disposal works fine. I just disconnected it yesterday because we needed her to pay for some other things this month." More laughter. A voice I didn't recognize asked, "Aren't you worried she'll figure it out eventually and kick you out?" "Please," my mother scoffed. "She's too soft. Besides, we're her parents. Where would we go? She'd never have the spine to actually evict us. She'd die of guilt first." "And by then," my father added, "she'll be too invested. This house will practically be ours anyway. She's unmarried, no kids. It'll all come back to us in the end. We're just enjoying the benefits early." The group erupted in laughter again. I don't remember backing away from the kitchen. I don't remember walking out the front door or getting into my car. The next thing I clearly recall is sitting in the parking lot of a Starbucks 3 miles away, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't lift the cup of coffee I'd apparently ordered. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Where are you? Thought you were coming with a plumber." I turned off my phone and sat there for hours, replaying their words over and over in my mind. The casual cruelty, the calculated manipulation, the utter lack of respect or love in their voices. For the first time, I saw the situation with perfect clarity. I wasn't helping my parents through a difficult time. I was being systematically exploited by people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to drain. Everything, every guilt trip, every emergency, every sad story had been orchestrated to keep their gravy train running. Something inside me hardened that day. The dutiful daughter who had always put her parents' needs first died in that Starbucks parking lot. In her place emerged someone new, someone who valued herself enough to say no more. The next morning, I called in sick to work and made 2 important appointments. One with a therapist who specialized in family trauma and one with a real estate attorney. The therapist listened calmly as I poured out the whole sordid story, then said something that changed my perspective completely. "Rita, supporting your parents isn't your obligation, especially when they're taking advantage of you. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary for your well-being." The attorney was equally direct. "Legally, they have no claim to your property. They've established no rental agreement, paid no rent, and contributed nothing to the mortgage or taxes. Washington state law requires a 60-day notice for eviction of month-to-month tenants, which is the closest legal category they fall into. We can have papers drawn up today." I spent the weekend in my apartment, ignoring calls and texts from my parents, who were growing increasingly concerned about my unusual silence. I used the time to create a detailed spreadsheet of everything I had spent on them over the past 3 years. Mortgage payments, $70,200, utilities, $13,680, home repairs and maintenance, $9,450, direct cash loans, $12,800, groceries and miscellaneous expenses, $7,320. The grand total made me physically ill, $113,450, more than enough for the master's degree I'd put on hold. Enough for a substantial down payment on a place in the city closer to my job. Enough to have changed the trajectory of my own life, sacrificed instead to fund my parents' voluntary unemployment and comfortable lifestyle. On Monday morning, I had the eviction notice ready. I drove to the house, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. My parents were both home, lounging in the living room I had furnished, watching the large smart TV I had purchased last Christmas. "Rita," my mother exclaimed when I walked in, "we were worried sick. Why haven't you been answering our calls, and what happened with the plumber?" I placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. "This is a 60-day eviction notice. You have until June 21st to find other accommodations and move out of my property." The shock on their faces would have been comical under different circumstances. My father recovered first, his expression morphing from surprise to outrage. "What the hell is this? You can't evict us. We're your parents." "Actually, I can. I'm the sole owner of this property and you have no legal right to be here. I've been more than generous allowing you to live here rent-free for 3 years. That arrangement is now terminated." My mother's eyes filled with tears, the same manipulative tears I'd fallen for countless times before. "How could you do this to us? After everything we've sacrificed for you, where will we go?" "You should have thought about that before you called me your personal ATM and laughed about manipulating me, before you disconnected a working garbage disposal just to get more money out of me. I heard everything, Mom, last Tuesday. You and Dad and your friends laughing about how I'd never have the spine to evict you." The color drained from both their faces. My father attempted to backpedal. "You misunderstood, Rita. We were just joking around. You know how people talk." 60 days, I repeated, turning to leave. "Not 1 day more. If you're not out by then, the sheriff will escort you out." My mother grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "You ungrateful bitch," she hissed, all pretense of the loving mother gone. "We gave you life, we raised you, you owe us." I looked her directly in the eyes, no longer afraid of her disapproval or anger. "I owe you nothing, not anymore." I left with her screams following me out the door, calling me every horrible name she could think of. In my car, I finally broke down, sobbing until my throat was raw and my eyes burned. I was grieving, not for the loss of my relationship with my parents, but for the fact that the relationship I thought we had never existed in the first place. The backlash was swift and vicious. Within hours, my phone was flooded with messages from relatives I barely spoke to, all expressing their shock and disgust at my actions. My mother's sister, Aunt Paula, called to tell me I was dead to the family for throwing my own parents out on the street. My father's brother left a voicemail saying he had never been so disappointed in anyone in his life. The accusations were all variations on the same theme. I was selfish, heartless, cruel. No one bothered to ask for my side of the story. No one questioned why I might have taken such a drastic step after years of support. In their eyes, the mere fact that my parents entitled them to unlimited access to my resources. My parents escalated their tactics. My father called my workplace, attempting to speak to my boss about my mental health issues, a transparent attempt to damage my professional reputation. My mother suddenly developed chest pains and was rushed to the emergency room, only to be released hours later with a diagnosis of anxiety. The message was clear: see what you're doing to us. The most devastating blow came when I discovered they had taken out credit cards in my name using personal information they had access to while living in my house. They had racked up over $15,000 in debt across 3 cards. I filed police reports and fraud claims, adding another layer of betrayal to an already painful situation. As the eviction date approached, my parents tried a new strategy: denial. They simply acted as if the eviction notice didn't exist. They made no efforts to find new housing, packed nothing, and continued their lives as if my ultimatum had been a momentary outburst with no real consequences. I visited once 2 weeks before the deadline to see if they had made any progress toward moving out. The house was exactly as it had always been, with no signs of packing or preparation. "We're not going anywhere," my father informed me calmly. "You'll change your mind, you always do." On the morning of June 21st, I arrived at the house with Sheriff Martinez and 2 deputies. My parents had been informed of the exact time we would arrive to enforce the eviction, but they had still made no arrangements. When we entered, they were sitting in the living room, still in their bathrobes, drinking coffee as if it were any other day. "You actually brought the police?" my mother asked incredulously. "Your own parents? These officers are here to enforce a legal eviction order," Sheriff Martinez explained. You have 2 hours to gather essential personal belongings. After that, the property will be secured and you will not be permitted to return without the owner's consent. Only then did the reality of the situation seem to hit them. My mother began wailing while my father paced and made frantic phone calls to relatives. None were willing to take them in. The truth they had never wanted to face, that they had alienated everyone in their lives with their entitled behavior, was finally unavoidable. "Where are we supposed to go?" my father demanded. I handed him a printed list. "Here are addresses for extended stay hotels within your budget. Your combined Social Security income is enough to cover a modest apartment. You've had 60 days to figure this out." In the end, they rented a U-Haul and loaded it with their possessions, cursing me the entire time. A distant cousin finally agreed to let them stay in his basement temporarily. As they drove away, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely. The aftermath of the eviction was both liberating and challenging. I spent the first month having the house deep cleaned and repaired. My parents had not been kind to the property. There were stains on the carpets, holes in the walls, and signs of neglect everywhere. It cost nearly $8,000 to restore it to rentable condition. I hired a property management company and found reliable tenants, a young family who paid their deposit and first month's rent without complaint. The steady income from the property now went toward building my future rather than subsidizing my parents' lifestyle. With the financial drain finally plugged, I enrolled in the online master's program I had postponed for so long. I moved to a nicer apartment closer to work, cutting my commute from 45 minutes to 15. I started dadding again, this time without the baggage of parasitic parents to explain or hide. The therapist helped me work through the guilt and grief that still surfaced occasionally. "You're mourning the parents you deserve to have," she explained during one particularly difficult session. "It's okay to be sad about that loss, even while being proud of yourself for setting healthy boundaries." 3 months after the eviction, the calls and texts from my parents stopped abruptly. I learned through a mutual acquaintance that they had managed to manipulate my father's sister into taking them in, spinning a tale of their ungrateful daughter who had abandoned them in their time of need. I felt a moment of worry for my aunt, knowing she was their next target, but I had to remind myself that she was an adult making her own choices, just as I had finally made mine. I had just submitted my first semester final projects when the first conciliatory text arrived from my mother. "Rita, we miss you. We've been doing a lot of thinking about how things went wrong between us. Maybe we could meet for coffee and talk things through. Family shouldn't be apart like this." I didn't respond. A week later, my father tried. "Your mother and I are struggling without your help. Aunt Debbie is asking us to contribute to rent and utilities, which seems unfair given our fixed income. We're family, we should be supporting each other. Can we please talk?" Again, I didn't engage. The messages continued, growing increasingly desperate as weeks passed. Reading between the lines, it was clear that my aunt was setting boundaries of her own and my parents were looking for their next host. 6 months after the eviction, on a crisp December morning, they showed up at my apartment unannounced. I had just returned from a 5K charity run, still in my running clothes, when I found them waiting by my door. My mother rushed forward as if to hug me, but I stepped back. "What are you doing here?" "We've come to make amends," my father said, his voice gentler than I had heard it in years. "We've realized our mistakes, how we took advantage of your generosity. We've changed, Rita." "Aunt Debbie kicked us out," my mother admitted after an uncomfortable silence. "We have nowhere to go. It's freezing out there and the shelters are all full. Please, Rita, we're still your parents." In that moment, looking at the two people who had given me life but taken so much more, I felt neither hatred nor love, just a profound sense of detachment. These weren't my parents in any meaningful sense of the word. They were simply two older adults who had made poor choices and were now facing the consequences. "I'm not letting you move in with me," I said calmly. "That part of our relationship is over permanently, but I will help you one last time." I took out my phone and made a few calls, then handed my father a piece of paper with an address. "This is a senior living assistance center. They have emergency housing vouchers and can help you apply for subsidized senior apartments. I've made an appointment for you this afternoon. This is the last time I will intervene." My mother's face contorted with anger. That's it? After everything? Yes, I interrupted. That's it. I wish you both well, but my financial support ends here. I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside. Goodbye. As I closed the door on their protests, I felt the final pieces of my old self, the dutiful daughter trained to sacrifice her own well-being for people who gave nothing in return, fall away completely. In the year since that day, I've completed my master's degree, earned a promotion at work, and even started dating someone who respects my boundaries and supports my goals. I occasionally hear updates about my parents through the family grapevine. They eventually secured a subsidized apartment for seniors and seem to be adjusting to life without their human ATM. Sometimes, I still feel twinges of guilt or sadness for what might have been if they had been capable of genuine love rather than exploitation. But those moments pass quickly, replaced by pride in my hard-won freedom and determination to never again allow anyone to treat me as a resource rather than a person. The house in Renton continues to appreciate in value, its rental income now funding a retirement account that will ensure I never find myself in the position my parents created for themselves. I've learned that true family, whether biological or chosen, builds each other up rather than tears each other down. And most importantly, I've learned that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's an essential act of self-preservation. My parents called me their personal bank, so I closed the account permanently. It was the best investment in myself I've ever made.